They laughed at my black father in court, mocked him, and humiliated him in front of everyone. Years later, I returned, not as a son, but as the judge presiding over the very case that would destroy the arrogant man who thought he was untouchable. Justice, revenge, and redemption collide in a courtroom showdown no one will ever forget. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave your comments. My father, dressed in a simple suit that had seen better days, clutched my mother's hand tightly. His back was straight, his jaw firm, but his eyes betrayed the tension that years of hard work could not erase. We weren't there to celebrate. We were there to fight. Years earlier, my father had been accused of embezzlement in his small town. He had worked as a foreman in a local manufacturing plant, supervising dozens of employees. One day, a miscalculation in inventory entirely out of his control led to the company losing a modest sum. The owner, a white man who had built the company from scratch, called it theft, called my father dishonest, and dragged him into court. Court day had been the most humiliating day of his life. The judge, the lawyers, even the jury, they looked at him as though he were guilty before a single word was spoken. When my father tried to speak, to explain, the prosecutor smirked. Some of the spectators in the gallery snickered. One whispered loud enough for him to hear, "He doesn't belong here." My father swallowed the humiliation. He didn't fight it out loud. He had always been the type to endure quietly, to keep his pride intact even while others tore it to shreds, but I never forgot. I was 12 that day. I sat on the second row, my small hands gripping the wooden pew, watching people I didn't even know laugh at my father. The courtroom echoes of ridicule replayed in my mind for years. I made a silent promise that day. One day, I would return, not just as a man, but as someone who held the power to rewrite history. I buried myself in books, in school, in debate clubs, and eventually in law. Every case I studied, every legal precedent I memorized, was fuel for a fire that had been lit in a small courthouse all those years ago. I became meticulous. I became strategic. While my peers partied and wasted time, I built a plan, not just for revenge, but for justice. For my father, for everyone who had ever been humiliated because of their skin, their status, or their dignity. Years passed. I went to law school, graduated top of my class, and secured an internship with a prestigious judicial firm. My father's story never left me. In fact, it became the lens through which I viewed every injustice I encountered. I began to specialize in corporate law and courtroom litigation. I represented clients who had been underestimated, humiliated, or dismissed by the system. Every win, every precedent, every careful maneuver in court sharpened my skills. But nothing satisfied me more than the thought of the man who had laughed at my father. That case had left a mark, not just on my father, but on the town itself. People whispered about it for years. It wasn't enough for me to simply succeed. I needed him to see, to understand, and to feel the weight of what he had done. I didn't know it at the time, but fate was quietly aligning. The factory owner's company was expanding. He had become a judge of minor cases in town, a small appointment, but a position that carried influence. The courtroom where my father had been humiliated was still active. The old judge had retired, and the courtroom retained its intimidating grandeur. The same pews, the same smell of old wood and ink, the same echoing acoustics. I walked in once to measure the space, to imagine the moment I would someday step in, not as a son in the audience, but as a person of authority. I began working on smaller cases in town, climbing the ranks. I volunteered for every assignment, researched every law, every precedent, and every loophole I could exploit. Every conversation with mentors, every courtroom observation was another brick in the foundation of what would come. And slowly, inexorably, I was becoming the person capable of turning the tables. One evening, I ran into one of the spectators who had snickered at my father years ago. He didn't recognize me. Too many years had passed. But the memory of that day was fresh in mind. I learned that the factory owner, the same man who had accused my father falsely, had financial mismanagement problems now. Bad investments, lawsuits, rumors of corruption. I began to quietly gather information. Bank statements, public records, civil complaints, everything I could find legally. I didn't rush. I couldn't. A hasty plan would be my undoing. The more I dug, the clearer it became. The man who had laughed at my father's dignity was now vulnerable. And the moment of reckoning would be spectacular. By the time I was 29, I had become a highly respected young attorney. I had argued cases that had made the local press, won motions that even senior lawyers had underestimated me on. But the ultimate case, the one that mattered most, was still ahead. I started volunteering in the very court where my father had been humiliated. Subtle maneuvers, learning procedural patterns, understanding how judges ruled, how clerks moved, everything. My goal was not just to be present. It was to gain control of my future authority. And then, the opportunity arose. A small judicial election opened a judgeship seat in our county, the very seat that would preside over civil cases, including some involving the very man who had humiliated my father. I submitted my nomination quietly, strategically, and with precision. I was not the favorite. I was underestimated. People laughed behind closed doors, whispering, "Who does he think he is?" But as the results came in, I realized the impossible was happening. I was on track to become the judge who would one day sit in the same courtroom, at the same bench, and decide the fate of the man who had once laughed at my father's dignity. And I would not fail. But now, I wasn't sitting in the pews as a powerless son. I walked through those doors wearing a black robe, papers in my hand, gavel ready. I was the judge. The courtroom fell silent as I entered. People whispered behind me, some glancing at the defendant with curiosity, others at the sun-turned authority figure. And there he was, the man who had laughed at my father. He hadn't aged gracefully. Greed and arrogance had left lines etched deep into his face. He looked at me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was mixed with disbelief. "Judge." This is," he stammered. I raised my gavel and let the silence linger. This wasn't just about personal revenge. I had spent months building a legally airtight case against him. Financial mismanagement, civil complaints, ethical violations, all meticulously documented. I would not let emotion cloud the law. I would let the law itself do the punishing. The first document was revealed, a series of mismanaged accounts and fraudulent expense reports. My tone was calm, almost gentle, as I addressed the court. "Mr. Harrison, your actions have put multiple employees at risk, and your fraudulent claims violate the basic principles of corporate and civil law." His face paled. He tried to smirk, tried to bluff, but every document, every statement, every verified piece of evidence I presented chipped away at his facade. The courtroom leaned in, captivated by the meticulous unraveling of a once powerful man. I called witnesses, former employees, auditors, and even the spectators from years ago who had laughed at my father. They told the truth calmly, clearly, without exaggeration. Their words carried weight, but their silent resentment for his arrogance spoke volumes. I looked directly at him, my voice firm but controlled. "Do you remember laughing at a hard-working man years ago because of his race? Do you remember undermining his dignity, believing it gave you power?" He froze. The courtroom went completely silent. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't just legal evidence anymore, it was moral judgment. The evidence was overwhelming. Every attempt he made to defend himself fell apart. His arrogance, which had once been his shield, became the instrument of his downfall. I delivered the verdict with absolute clarity. Based on the evidence and testimonies presented, I hereby find the defendant guilty of corporate fraud, ethical violations, and conduct unbecoming of a professional. Sentencing will follow immediately. The gavel hit the desk. The sound echoed through the room like the final hammer striking a tombstone. He gasped, words failing him. The same man who had mocked my father now faced judgment not just legally, but symbolically, his power and pride shattered before everyone in the room. After court, I stepped outside into the sunlight. My father, who had come to watch the trial, embraced me silently. No words were necessary. The look in his eyes said it all. Pride, relief, and justice. He whispered softly, almost choking back emotion. "You did it." "You actually did it," I smiled, letting him hold that moment. Years of waiting, of planning, of silent determination, all culminated in this single act of justice. News outlets picked up the story immediately. Judge delivers verdict against former corporate tyrant. Son of humiliated employee seeks justice. Social media exploded. The man who had once laughed at a black father was now widely condemned. His reputation destroyed, his arrogance laid bare. He became the cautionary tale people whispered about. My father's name was finally cleared. His dignity, once stolen, was now restored. And for me, the journey from humiliated son to authoritative judge was complete. Reflection's justice is not always swift. Revenge, if it comes, must be calculated. I didn't act in haste. I didn't act out of anger. I acted with precision, knowledge, and patience. The courtroom had become a stage where arrogance was punished and humility was recognized. I had learned that true power is not in humiliation, but in preparation, foresight, and restraint. As we walked out together, father and son, the sunlight casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, I knew that some laughter would never return, and it shouldn't. If you liked my story, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with as many people as possible. Thanks for watching.